Welcome to Order from Ashes. As our listeners know, we've been living through a crazy period in international affairs in which the U.S. has taken its runaway ability and willingness to exercise war with no oversight and justification to new levels, levels that are hard to understand and that often, from where I sit, seem nearly impossible to put back in a box. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, director of Century International. You're listening to the Order from Ashes podcast. Today, I'm joined by legal expert Brian Finucane, who's a senior advisor at International Crisis Group and also a former State Department lawyer. And he's here to help unpack this really kind of daunting question, which is what happened to America's deliberative process and checks and balances on starting wars, and how can we bring that back? Brian, thanks so much for being willing to come on the podcast.
Oh, good to join you.
Let's start with the most recent instance of runaway war. I don't know if we should call it runaway war powers or runaway war making and no exercise of war powers. How has the U.S. flaunted its own norms and laws in pursuing its war against Venezuela?
So the Venezuela Operation Absolute Resolve, the decapitation raid into Caracas earlier this month, earlier in January, the capture of Nicolas Maduro and his wife, airstrikes and the killing of dozens of people on the ground, was a flagrant violation of international law, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force by states in their international relations. And that's the legal prohibition that the U.S. was a key architect of and helped establish. And what's really notable about the military incursion into Venezuela is the Trump administration has not proffered any sort of serious international legal argument that somehow the operation was lawful, somehow it comported with the UN Charter. Instead, it has labeled the operation a law enforcement operation. And the Department of Justice has asserted in a recently released memorandum that the president can simply override international law, override the UN Charter. And so this is striking both in terms of the operation itself, but also the implications for the global legal order that the U.S. helped build after World War II.
And a little ways later, we'll come to the question of the sort of gap between the legal order and actual practice of strong states, which I think you have a lot of interesting things to say about as well. But while we're, you just mentioned the UN Charter. There are other legal orders that have been important to the United States that are in play here, right? That both the ones that govern conduct at sea and also aren't there U.S. laws that and constitutional requirements that come into play when a White House decides that it wants to invade a country, kidnap its sovereign head of state, and take its resources?
Absolutely. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution gives to Congress, not the president, but to Congress, the power to declare war and related war authorities. And this was a deliberate design by the framers of the Constitution. They wanted to make going to war hard and required collective decision-making by people's elected representatives, because this is one of the most consequential decisions that the country can make, this expenditure of blood and treasure and the potential destabilizing effects that the conflict could have. And so what's remarkable here is that the president did not obtain congressional authorization for this elective military operation. The framers of the Constitution understood that the president would have some authority for unilaterally using force without prior congressional authorization. But that was expected to be limited to repelling sudden attacks by the United States. Okay, obviously that's not what happened in Venezuela at all. There was no sudden attack upon the United States. This was a completely discretionary military intervention and no attempt to obtain authorization from Congress. But it also comes in the midst of an ongoing campaign by the administration in Latin America of maritime strikes against alleged drug smugglers, both in the Caribbean and now in the Pacific. And these have caused a number of legal experts, including a host of former U.S. government national security lawyers, to announce the strikes as unlawful, including under U.S. criminal laws that prohibit murder on the high seas and conspiracy to commit murder outside the United States.
So let's continue. So this is, depressing but not surprising, especially given the last quarter centuries of history of U.S. military action abroad. Help contextualize this a little bit. my clock on this tends to start with the wars after 9/11, and feel free to widen the scope if you think it's appropriate. Take us a little bit through how, the wars that we fought, the U.S. fought after 9/11. Were those more legally authorized than the ones we've gotten used to, or how deep and how long running is the norm of either just not seeking justification and admitting it's a war, or, as I think this administration has done in Venezuela, pretending that the thing they've done is a law enforcement action, and simply does not rise to the criteria of being a war, and therefore needing some kind of authorization.
So in certain respects, the administration has tried to cloak both the boat strikes and then the military campaign against Venezuela itself in the mantle of counterterrorism, tried to repurpose the sort of war on terror framing. But there's a really critical distinctions between these. Okay, but what we remember is that the war on terror was kicked off by the 9/11 attacks on the United States, which Al-Qaeda killed nearly 3,000 people. This was an armed attack upon the United States. In the immediate aftermath, Congress enacted a war authorization to provide the White House authority to use military force against the perpetrators of that attack. The UN Security Council recognized that the U.S. had a right of self-defense. And of course, the U.S. went after Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and later ISIS in the course of the war on terror. Now, what is critical about this is that those were actually organized armed groups with which the country could be in an armed conflict with. Congress had authorized those hostilities, and it followed an armed attack upon the United States. None of that was true for the boat strikes. There's been no armed attack upon the United States. Congress has not authorized these strikes. And they're taking place not against organized armed groups, as far as we can tell, but alleged drug smugglers, okay, or potential fishermen aboard these vessels. So this is not like fighting Al-Qaeda or ISIS, which is why so many people have characterized these strikes as simply premeditated killing or murder. And that's also true for the administration's attempt to frame the Maduro government and the so-called Cartel de Soles as terrorists, right? They're trying to repurpose these framings, labeling both the people of these boats and the Venezuelan leadership as terrorists to justify the use of force in part to the U.S. public. But I think it's also his marketing to President Trump because he likes dramatic performative military action against terrorists broadly defined. Baghdadi in his first term, Qasem Soleimani, and I think that there were the Secretary of State and others tried to sell him on taking out Maduro on the same sort of basis.
Now, in this conversation, because there's so many threads we could bring in, I want to try and keep us as close as possible to the question of congressional power and congressional oversight, because I think otherwise we could end up in a 10-hour conversation about illegal American interventions in the world and different ways in which U.S. military power has been used for criminal ends or in criminal ways. So I want to get us sort of quickly back to today's moment, but a little bit ask whether and when the norm changed. It's definitely my colloquial sort of my layman's impression as a non-lawyer observing the way in which American politicians discussed intervention from 2001 to today, that there's been a real shift. Like in the beginning, in the lead up to the war in Iraq, for example, there was a widespread view that there needed to be UN authorization. There was a widespread view that a war that maybe too many people thought was a good idea without really scrutinizing it, nonetheless needed at least the veneer of a legal justification. And we had these two authorizations for the use of military force, one which you already referenced in 2001, and then the second one in 2002, that initially were about giving the U.S. Authority to go after the people who attacked the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. But 10 years later, and certainly 20 years later, these same authorizations were being used to go after groups that didn't exist, individuals that hadn't been born in 2001, countries that had no tie whatsoever to the conspiracy that led to 9/11. And at some point, it ceased. It seems to me anyway, and this is, I know it sounds like it's a monologue and not a question, but it seems like the U.S. establishment gave up on the belief that there needed to be a legal justification. So I'm wondering if you think that's true. How and when did that happen? Where did we get to a place where a liberal like Barack Obama could decide in an executive council, secret executive council of senior officials to drone to death an American citizen in Yemen, and very few people in power thought that was a problematic legal or policy decision?
So I think several different dynamics at play here. One was the routinization of targeted killing away from sort of hot battlefields, as it were, and the extent to which that habituated people both within the government and the broader public to that sort of activity. I think another significant dynamic here is how the Iraq War played out and its effect upon the willingness of both Congress and the executive to seek congressional authorization. I think one of the lessons that members of Congress took away from the Iraq War, and including and also from the 2008 Democratic presidential primary, is that taking hard votes on matters of war and peace was a political liability. And so Congress in recent decades has, as an institution and many members have tried to avoid taking those hard votes. And relatedly, the executive branch has gotten used to not going to Congress to ask for votes. We saw this dynamic play out ultimately in a fashion after the Obama administration thought about and almost came to the brink of intervening in Syria in 2013, conducting strikes in retaliation for the use of the sarin gas tech. And it was clear that Congress was not going to authorize it. And that was a lesson that the administration took on board, and so it didn't wait in 2014 when it went after ISIS in Iraq and Syria. It didn't wait for congressional authorization; it just did it. And so I think that started creating, or fed into an expectation that executive would just act unilaterally, and that Congress could sit back, and if things went badly, they could throw stones, and if it didn't, if things went well, they could cheer it on, but they could be bystanders. So I think that there's a broader arc from World War II onwards, but I think in recent decades that's been a significant dynamic here.
Is that new in U.S. history? I mean, so I guess the idea, as I understand it, is that the Congress is the closest branch to the public will, right? It's the most democratic, most representative branch. That's why Congress reserves the power, or rather, the Constitution reserves exclusively to Congress the power to decide whether to go to war or not. And I certainly know that in the lead up to World War II, there was a lot of emphasis put on getting congressional approval, in part because for the U.S. intervention in World War II to succeed, it would need broad public buy-in. Now, one of the things you didn't mention, but that has really changed the dynamic, is that because we have a professional military, not a draft military, it turns out to be possible to indefinitely be at war and apparently not pay a political cost. Although I think we'll get to this later. I think we have paid a huge cost in terms of democratic practices domestically in the United States. But in any event, for the politicians making these decisions, there's no harm, no foul for them if they screw it up, or if people die, or if it's a terrible policy that causes instability. So that seems new. Is it the case that in the entire history of the American Republic, we have never had a period of time where the executive branch has repeatedly, through changes of parties and through changes of leadership, been able, with no scrutiny, no oversight, and no accountability, to initiate new foreign wars?
So, I mean, the executive branch and the executive branch lawyers will point you to, hundreds of incidents in the course of the last few hundred years of the executive branch using military force unilaterally. But most of those tended to be, very limited actions, often by Marines or naval vessels overseas, and sometimes acting on their own volition without, direction from Washington in the days before rapid communications. Many of these were very limited engagements. The high watermark for unilateral action by the executive in terms of using military force was the so-called police action in Korea by the Truman administration, where President Truman did not obtain authorization beforehand. I do think that
Did he after the fact, or did he
so
never have
no, there was never a war authorization as such, but Congress effectively did approve of it through funding later on. So the Congress funded the war effort, and that is the power of the purse is Congress's ultimate war power. But in terms of, I think you are onto something in terms of like the professional military, the non-draft military, providing the executive a certain degree of latitude to use force. I think another factor is the way that this administration particularly is using force, which is that it likes performative airstrikes and commando raids, but does not like large-scale ground deployments. I think that's the lesson that this president particularly took away from the Iraq War. Like, there's a high political cost to be paid for body bags coming back home from foreign battlefields. But if you don't have U.S. Fatalities coming home, there's a lot more space to wield unilateral military force. Fewer political risks associated with that.
Yeah, and I think the Venezuela action illustrates some interesting, if toxic, learning from past experience. So one is that foreign lives apparently don't matter to the American political order. So killing, innocent fishermen who aren't even Venezuelan turns out to be like politically tenable. And also, I mean, I found really interesting that the U.S. seemed to have designed a regime change or leadership change invasion of Venezuela that did not involve an occupation, right? So it is an invasion. There is not a U.S. occupation for the time being, although I guess legally speaking, maybe confiscating Venezuela's oil resources might legally constitute some form of occupation, but certainly as public as sort of colloquially understood, this is invasion without occupation or regime decapitation, however you want to put it, without boots on the ground, which is a further refinement of this idea of like forever war without short term domestic cost.
Yeah, I mean, this president likes performative military action. He likes spectacular wins, and the incursion into Venezuela was very much one of those in his mind. I just want to remind listeners that although it was a very impressive tactical feat, there was still obviously there were fatalities in Venezuela, including civilians, and one of the U.S. helicopters involved was shot up, and apparently it was a close run thing as to whether it would have gone down. Obviously, if there had been sort of a Black Hawk Down incident in Caracas, we would be looking back at this operation very differently. The president seems to have been emboldened by this spectacular military success, which is why you see this armada steaming towards the Persian Gulf at the moment, and why you've heard in the wake of the Operation Venezuela, threats against, Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, and a week or so ago, Greenland, and the president reportedly brought up the issue of Venezuela in his call with Minnesota's Governor Walz the other day, and so he really
Well,
has.
sorry, what did Venezuela have to do with Minnesota?
Well, my understanding of the
I know it's not your I know it's not your argument, but help us
well,
understand.
yes. So my understanding of what Governor Walz relayed based on his phone call with the president is that the president said, said something along the lines of everything went so well in Venezuela, it should go well in Minnesota as well.
Good God. Well, we're going to get back to that in the third section of this conversation. Really quick, before we end section one, why did the efforts to put on some kind of congressional oversight of the Venezuela operation fail?
Largely because the majority party in both houses of Congress is not interested. So neither the House Foreign Affairs Committee chair, nor until yesterday did the Senate Foreign Relations chair, hold hearings on this. There was finally a hearing yesterday, which Secretary of State Marco Rubio testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. A few weeks ago, the minority on HVAC, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, held what's called a shadow hearing on Venezuela, which two retired, very senior U.S. diplomats with broad experience in Latin America testified, and I joined them to discuss the war powers implications. But the bottom line is that we live in a regime of separation of parties, not separation of powers, and that's one of the things that complicates effective oversight and effective congressional pushback on executive overreach.
And I mean, is it your understanding? So, okay, what part of what you're describing is a reality that we know well, which is that right now in this current moment, most elected Republican legislators are not interested in acting in any way as with any daylight from the president. But it's also my understanding that there's like a sad and distasteful bipartisan history of legislators being all too happy to let the executive branch, even from the other party, have this kind of untrammeled power. Is that right?
That has been the pattern for much of, sort of the post 9/11 period. I think it really has shifted just in sort of recent years. And I think we've seen these demonstrated in the last year. There's been a number of war powers resolutions introduced, particularly in the Senate, to push back and to terminate unauthorized military action by this administration. There was a resolution last summer on Iran. There have been multiple resolutions with respect to the boat strikes and with respect to Venezuela. They've gotten unanimous or near unanimous Democratic support, but only a handful of Republicans have joined them, which is why they haven't passed. And so it is, you do see these things break down at the moment along partisan lines. But there are some, really impressive and extended counterexamples, like, Senator Rand Paul yesterday at the SFRC hearing spoke very eloquently about the constitutional allocation of war powers and pushed back against the notion that somehow this, quote, law enforcement operation into Venezuela wasn't a war and didn't implicate Congress's constitutional prerogatives.
I'm Thanassis Cambanis. You're listening to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast. Today I'm joined by Brian Finucane, a legal expert at the International Crisis Group and former State Department lawyer. We're talking about war powers and the hopefully possibility of restraining a quarter century of untrammeled executive action in the United States. I want to spend the next section of our conversation talking about the effort to refurbish or renew war powers, to either bring back or create a new sort of re-empowered congressional role and congressional oversight. And I know you've been involved for a long time in advocating for that and describing what that would look like. And I do feel like at a moment where so much feels out of control and hopeless, that it's useful to hear about this proposal, which seems at a sort of minimal degree of sanity, but also it seems like something that's been long out of reach. So tell us how it would work to actually restore the constitutional balance of powers and put Congress back in charge of deciding when to go to war.
Sure. For listeners' background, there was already an attempt to do this in the waning years and months of the Vietnam conflicts and related conflicts in Southeast Asia. In 1973, Congress enacted the War Powers Resolution over the veto of President Nixon, and it was intended to reestablish Congress's authority, its prerogatives with respect to war and peace, and ensure that Congress is not surprised by the president taking the country to war, and that impose guardrails and time limits on the ability of the president to use military force unilaterally. To that end, it imposed notification requirements for certain military actions and imposed a 60-day deadline for any unauthorized military action by the president, and also provide for mechanisms by which even the minority in Congress could force a vote to require the removal of U.S. armed forces from hostilities. Unfortunately, that piece of legislation has not been terribly effective at constraining the executive, has not been terribly effective at reasserting Congress's prerogatives in this space. And so in recent years, there have been a number of proposals and bipartisan legislation introduced in both houses during the Biden administration that would update, reform, or rewrite the War Powers Resolution to give it better teeth, to shorten the deadlines for using military force without authorization, to close supposed loopholes, and to actually impose automatic funding cutoffs. Again, the power of the purse being the ultimate war power. These would cut off funds for any military operations that had not received congressional authorization.
What's the time frame for that?
So the 20 days, I think, is the time frame put out in at least one of the I think it's the Senate version of the legislation. The current time limits imposed by the 1973 War Powers Resolution are 60 days. In addition, there have also been a number of reactive measures put forward in both houses of Congress particularly in this administration, to try to stop the president from using force or remove U.S. forces from unauthorized hostilities. Again, in Iran, the boat strikes, and Venezuela. And we may see another measure if the administration proceeds with another further attack on Iran.
How have past administrations gotten around the War Powers Act 60-day time limit on funding?
So there currently is no automatic funding cutoff in the law. But the way they've gotten around the 60-day time limit is often through creative lawyering. So the clock starts ticking when U.S. armed forces are introduced into quote hostilities that have not been authorized by Congress. And so some of the games that administrations play of both parties is they claim that, well, there's no hostilities, these airstrikes don't constitute hostilities, don't trigger the clock, or they claim that, well, the hostilities were introduced to U.S. armed forces, therefore the clock doesn't start. That interpretation argument was used by the Biden administration to bomb the Houthis for a year, for example. And the former interpretation that there's no hostilities to start with, that's the argument that the Trump administration has used to continue these boat strikes since last September without any sort of congressional authorization.
So how do you get around this process? So sounds like some good, strong general concepts, and the most powerful of them just being that automatically the funding turns off unless affirmatively Congress authorizes a conflict. How do you get around the slippery nature of defining a conflict, which I think is the signature element of the last quarter century's wars? Most of them have been fought under the guise of not actually being a war or being a declared war.
Yeah, so one of the weaknesses of the 73 law is that it does not define the term hostilities. So defining key terms is important, it turns out. Another potential mechanism, in addition to that, is providing for judicial review, some mechanism to challenge executive action in the courts. It turns out in practice it's been virtually impossible to bring any sort of legal challenges under the current War Powers Resolution. So one of the pieces of reform legislation that was introduced in the House provides sort of procedures and mechanisms by which Congress can challenge unauthorized military actions in the court and actually force a sort of ruling.
So how do you define hostilities in order to encompass not just things like the huge land invasion of Iraq, but something like the invasion of Venezuela we just saw, or I think something that the 90 or so undeclared conflicts that America is fighting at any given time?
There are a number of definitions out there. I think in broad strokes, you want to encompass lethal or potentially lethal uses of force by or against U.S. armed forces, whether an offense or defense, even if they are conducted remotely, and regardless of how intermittent they might be. Okay, and so you want to make sure you clearly encompass things like airstrikes. That was clearly the view of the Congress that enacted the original War Powers Resolution, but the Trump administration claims airstrikes don't count as hostility somehow. So you want to clearly encompass those. You want to clearly foreclose the argument that a defensive use of force somehow doesn't count. So you look at how various past administrations have tried to create supposed loopholes, and you try to close those. But again, I think this will also require other tools. Again, the judicial review being one of them. And ultimately, some of this is going to come down to whether the executive branch will faithfully execute the laws, faithfully uphold the laws. If you're dealing with an entirely scofflaw, executive, all this becomes much more challenging.
Right, and I mean this brings us back to a question that came up earlier, and probably this is a good time to float it. Having a robust War Powers Act is not going to stop bad wars from happening, right? Making war legal is not is not the same as somehow handcuffing the executive branch or the U.S. military. Why is it important, nonetheless, to have a robust legal oversight?
That's absolutely right. I mean, Congress, after all, did vote and authorize the invasion of Iraq in the 2002 AUMF.
It was a legal disaster.
It will, at least as
an
a matter
authorized disaster.
It was an authorized, yes, legal at least as a matter of U.S.
Sorry, I corrected myself.
It was authorized, and it's an authorized catastrophe. So no, there's no guarantee here. There's no silver bullet to prevent imprudent war making. The framers' notion that if you require collective decision making, you require public debate and deliberation, that's likely to lead to better outcomes than decisions made on a whim by one man. I think that is probably more likely to lead to better outcomes than say unilateral action. But again, there's no guarantees here. But so I do think like trying to build in more deliberation, more public debate into the system as the framers originally intended. I think that's likely to generate better outcomes overall, but it's certainly no guarantee that there won't be mistakes.
In your time in service in the government, did you get the feeling that people were concerned about this question? Is it legal? Is it justified? Is it authorized?
I think it varied depending on who you're talking about. Many lawyers would be very concerned about within the executive branch. Policymakers, perhaps less so. Often, policymakers looking for maximum freedom of action, laws that would constrain them would be a hindrance. And I think there's a range, even amongst policymakers, there's a range of views on how much they care about the law at all. So it's difficult to generalize. I will just say from everything I've seen of this current administration, both domestically and abroad, there's very little interest in paying any heed to legal constraints. The overriding attitude seems to be not whether something's lawful, but whether we can get away with it.
Yeah, and I mean this is, I think, a tough, or rather, a thing that people who believe in, say, the international liberal order or the rule of law sometimes struggle with. Like, I think there's a widespread sense across the ideological spectrum that lawyers and laws are impediments or pretexts or justifications for policy decisions that are made for other reasons. And I think in practice, that's what we've seen most of the time. That we turn to the lawyers and the law to tell us why it's okay that we're going to do the thing that we've decided to do. And in this debate, I find your voice really helpful because you don't seem to me to be talking about the law for the law's sake. You're talking about law and legal order and international rule of law as sources of legitimacy and justice and restraint and behaviors that are normatively desirable, and not just in order to check the box of being legal, but in order to subscribe to some deeper body of values and practices that we think are good in their own right.
That's right. I mean, the way that I look at this is that we have the international legal order that the U.S. itself built largely after the Second World War, for very important reasons. So the UN Charter comes out of the bitter experience of two world wars that killed tens of millions of people and the horrors of the Holocaust, and a desire to prevent further such conflicts, okay, further such devastating conflicts. And the U.S. was a key actor in creating this prohibition on the use of force. Similarly, with the Geneva Conventions and subsequent rules relating to the law of war, there are very good reasons and embedded policy decisions and policy wisdom reflected in these rules. And I think it's one of the challenges for lawyers in government, international lawyers, national security lawyers generally, is trying to communicate to clients and the general public as to why we have these rules in the first place. What are the sort of embedded policy reasons? What's the wisdom reflected in these rules? We don't have these rules just for the sake of having rules, not for the sake of some academic project, but these are forged through bitter experience in terrible conflicts to try to prevent such conflicts, and when they do happen, make them slightly less horrible and slightly more humane.
I can only think of one example since 9/11 when a US president claimed to want to engage in international military action abroad and then didn't, supposedly for lack of congressional authorization, and that's the Obama red line in Syria fiasco. Am I missing any other?
That's the most prominent one that comes to mind there.
And that to me also speaks of the problem here, because that my impression of that is that it was an insincere, a political decision was made not to do the right thing, and then it was justified by saying that Congress wouldn't have authorized it. And by the way, the president didn't actually seek congressional authorization. He refrained from seeking it after determining that it wouldn't pass.
That's more or less my recollection. I think the president felt, there'd been the prime minister of the UK had sought authorization from Parliament that had failed. I think the U.S. president felt forced to take a similar step, that he had to consult the legislature, and I think he got a strong signal from congressional leadership that he was not going to get authorization. And at the same time, there was a deal being worked out with Russia to address the bulk of Syria's chemical weapons stockpile. But yeah, I think that's one of the few instances I'm aware of or could really think of the U.S. president not resorting to military force, ostensibly on the grounds that he was not going to, get congressional authorization.
So the landscape here is one where political considerations seem to trump interest and legitimacy and justice in deciding when to go to war. There seems to be a sort of endemic lack of seriousness in all the branches of government about thinking of going to war as one of the most important decisions that the U.S. government or any government could do. A real indifference to the cost in human lives. I think a almost complete lack of interest in foreign lives lost, and frankly, a real lack of interest in the sort of broken lives of the survivors from the U.S. military who don't die in the forever wars, but are slowly dying in an epidemic of suicide and other long-term harm from the result of these wars. So when we look at this effort, this sort of small but growing effort to restore sanity, restore some interest and restraint, and bring back or bring into force some kind of new norm structure governing war powers. What's the political landscape? I mean, how large is the constituency of elected officials who are interested in this? How big of a deal is it to them? I mean, is it, are there among the people who are interested, is this like their main cause? Is it a second, third priority? How much should we think of this as something that might come to political reality and become part of American law and practice in our lifetimes?
So I think there is bipartisan interest on Capitol Hill. There have been these bipartisan pieces of legislation introduced in the last few years to revamp, replace the 1973 War Powers Resolution. At the moment, those have been stymied in part by partisan politics. So some of the actors who used to champion war powers reform, like Mike Lee, have been pretty quiet lately. He's not the only one. There are still very prominent people on the GOP side of the aisle who pushing back against presidential overreach with respect to use of military force. Again, Rand Paul in the Senate, and his fellow Kentuckian Tom Massey in the House. We recently had the repeal of the 1991 and 2002 Iraq war authorizations, and that was a bipartisan effort led by Tim Kaine, but also Republican Senator Todd Young from Indiana.
And that almost passed, but didn't. Is that right?
It did. It
did pass. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow.
I have here next to me on the desk here the signed legislation. It was a provision in the NDAA. So that was a years-long effort in Congress, and backed by folks in civil society.
Wait, when did that finally pass? Because I'm remembering all the failed efforts to do this.
That passed. It was the end of December
Wow.
President Trump signed it into law.
Look at that bright spot.
So, in some ways, this is should be low-hanging fruit. These are authorizations for wars that were fought in more or less over decades ago. But it took years to accomplish it because there were those who were hawks on the Hill and sometimes in the executive who wanted to keep those zombie war authorizations in the books to fight new wars.
And just to point this out to our listeners who don't know just how crazy this is, that an authorization passed by Congress specifically to bolster a war initiated on the back of a bunch of lies in Iraq was then being used for war after war after war in other places. And when legislators said, well, let's repeal this, I remember the counter argument being, well, it's up to you to come up with a replacement AUMF that justifies all the other wars we're waging off this, which I found so crazy and upside down that the people who are waging a bunch of undeclared wars don't view it as their responsibility to go to Congress for each war. I mean, if a war is legitimate, it shouldn't be that hard to just come to Congress and say, hey, we want to be at war in Mali and Mauritania and Yemen and this place and that place, and write a page on each one and get a bill passed. I think in general, American politicians have been pretty willing to say yes to even really stupid or ill-conceived wars. And the fact that it's like they don't even want to be forced to ask permission, and that they want those who oppose the wars to somehow come up with the justification for them to keep waging the wars seems like insane, and also reflective of a real sort of broken politics that no longer connects to the core values that motivated us as a country to be interested in not going to war whenever possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to see a replay of those discussions in coming months or year or so. One of the war authorizations that does remain on the books is the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, the principal statutory basis for fighting the war on terror. So going after Al Qaeda, the Taliban, and then later on ISIS, and then groups like Al Shabaab, who had nothing to do with 9/11. It didn't exist at the time, or whoever the folks are that the U.S. T-lambed in northern Nigeria on Christmas Day. So that's the one that's actually still being used by the administration, including to justify detention of the folks at Gitmo. And that's going to be a much more contentious reform or repeal or replacement effort for the sort of the reasons you touched upon, where the administration is going to likely demand some sort of replacement, and there'll be some back and forth. I'm not sure how that effort's going to go, but it seems to be sort of the next step after repealing those Iraq authorizations.
So we're talking on Thursday, January 29th. And right now, there's a pretty sizable military force being assembled in the Gulf and in strike distance of Iran for threatened strikes there. So by the time our listeners are hearing this podcast, there might have been another series of strikes on Iran, or that might have been resolved or postponed. Hard to judge. But what, if any, is the authorization or legal authority for the last summer strikes and the upcoming, or at least threatened, strikes on Iran?
So the administration has not said anything in terms of justification for any future strikes in Iran, has not gone to Congress for authorization. With respect to the strikes that happened last summer,
So Midnight Hammer, is that what that was called?
yeah, Operation Midnight Hammer, indeed.
Jesus.
Yeah. In terms of justification for that, as a matter of domestic law, the White House relied solely on Article 2 of the Constitution. Obviously, there was no congressional authorization for that.
Wait, Article 2, self-defense?
So Article 2, the president acting as commander in chief, they claimed that there were a number of sort of national interests involved and promoted by the military action. Also, invoked self-defense to some degree. And then the international legal justification cited both collective self-defense of Israel. We recall that Israel was in the midst of a 12-day bombing campaign against Iran at the time, but also it gestured towards U.S. national self-defense. Neither of those sets of justifications, neither the domestic nor the international justifications, were convincing to me. I didn't regard them as being particularly robust. And as you sort of gestured at earlier, they're consistent with this trend of just sort of legally backfilling a predetermined policy outcome.
You're listening to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast. I'm Thanassis Cambanis from Century International, and I'm talking today with Brian Finucane, a lawyer and a legal expert at International Crisis Group, former State Department lawyer. Brian, thanks so much for coming on the show today. And in the final section of our conversation, I want to turn to one of my favorite subjects, which is how to connect the international realm of illegality or sort of wanton misuse of American force abroad to problems at home. And I find that in the American political conversation, there seems to be a widely held and mistaken belief that all these things, even if you think they're a problem, don't really matter for Americans. That whether you think the invasion of Venezuela or bombing Iran or any of the rest of it is a good or bad idea, that one way or another, it's not material, not consequential for how Americans live their life in America, how America's governed, what happens here. Now, I have my own views on this, which I'm sure will become clear if they're not already. But I'm curious how how and what connections you draw between this climate of sort of, I guess, abuse, misuse or abuse of force, and also misuse and abuse of law to governance inside America.
Well, under this administration, one of the most obvious ways that they're connected, one of the most sort of apparent themes, is the repurposing of the war on terror, the terrorism framing, and applying it to new foes, both abroad and domestically. Okay, so you see the administration labeling not just the jihadists, the jihadis the U.S. has been bombing for decades as terrorists, but now immigrants. You saw this last year when the U.S. sent a couple hundred Venezuelan migrants down to Sikalt prison to face abuse in El Salvador. You see them relabeling Latin American criminals, narcos, as terrorists with the unprecedented designation of a number of such groups as foreign terrorist organizations last year. And
Including
then,
groups that might not even really exist as formal groups, right? Like the Undeclared.
yes, including groups that don't exist, Cartel de las Solas being a pretty prominent one. And then conducting, a campaign of lawless airstrikes on people at sea who the administration calls terrorists, right? These alleged drug traffickers are being killed on the basis that they are supposedly, terrorists. And you've also seen them use the terrorism framing, the terrorism smear, the slur against domestic political opponents in a number of ways. You recall the sort of labeling Antifa, which doesn't appear to be an organization, as a domestic terrorist group or a terrorist organization. And the U.S. the administration has used that rhetoric against a range of perceived domestic political opponents. Most recently in Minneapolis, with the terrible and tragic killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, where the administration referred to both of them as domestic terrorists, baselessly. Okay, and so they have asserted this license to kill outside the law, alleged terrorists at sea, and the question is now whether they're going to be wielding that supposed prerogative domestically. And the killings in Minneapolis are a real cause for concern on that front.
I think that's a great way of drawing that line. I mean, there's I think a long debate inside the United States about or maybe a deep ambivalence about the rights of accused criminals, right? In which our Constitution enshrines, and I think those of us who believe in the legal order really like the idea that even someone who demonstrably did something reprehensible has rights. That that's what makes this system, when it operates, more appealing than systems that are just arbitrary or in which you're presumed guilty. Now, I've heard it argued that this kind of abuse and overreach that you just described is not new. To me, it seems certainly as a sort of practice much more common and has really proliferated in the last couple of decades. But help us understand, because I mean the idea of domestic terrorism has been predates 9/11. Yeah, I mean depending on how far back you want to go, you can go back to the Alien and Sedition Acts period, and more than 100 years ago. So how new or how different are both of these phenomena? One, the phenomenon of calling domestic dissidents or actors who the government doesn't like terrorists, and two, embracing the idea that someone accused of terrorism does not have the same rights to due process as as quote unquote regular criminals.
So obviously there were seeds of both those trends dynamics going back to the George W. Bush administration, right? Even domestically, there were attempts to hold, for example, accused terrorists and captured on American soil, what we call Jose Padilla, hold him as an enemy combatant domestically. But these were tended to be sort of one-offs, okay? And the administration really did not lean that heavily, for all its various faults, did not lean heavily on trying to smear entire domestic demographics as terrorists. Um, that has really changed with this administration, where it's sort of, replaying the George W. Bush administration's approach to terrorism as farce, but dialed up to 11. Um, and then the other aspect of this is that it really is just an incredibly important distinction between law enforcement and war and the use of lethal force in both. In a law enforcement paradigm, lethal force is used in the last resort in defense against imminent harm to yourself or to others. Okay. In armed conflict and war, lethal force can be used as in the first resort against lawful targets and against enemy combatants, enemy fighters. And so when you switch that toggle, it makes all the difference in the world. And that's what we've seen taking place in the Caribbean, where for decades the U.S. has had this playbook where the Navy and Coast Guard work under a law enforcement paradigm to interdict vessels and stop them, and suspects are treated accordingly in the criminal justice system, prosecuted and have due process. That's all been thrown out the window, and people are simply being summarily executed now. And so the concern is that they're going to try to throw that toggle domestically as well by using this smear of terrorism, labeling people terrorists. Obviously, neither Renee Good nor Alex Peretti received any due process before they were gunned down.
Right. And I guess, I mean, the process you've described seems to have already taken place. And I think it's helpful to think of this as a threshold issue rather than as a binary. So, we live in a country where, police shootings of innocent people have always existed. If you are a person of color in America, especially if you're a black man, going back way longer than 9/11, you're at risk of unjustified, extrajudicial, indiscriminate police shootings or violence. So, from one perspective, one can see a long line of this kind of illegality or like sort of murderous overreach. On the other hand, what we've seen in recent years is a sea change, right? It's a change in scale. I think it crosses us into a threshold where we have what we see in Minneapolis, which I mean reminds me very acutely of what it looked like on the ground in Iraq, where I lived for many years as a civilian journalist, and one of the sort of constant background things was just people getting killed at checkpoints for not even doing anything suspicious by jumpy soldiers. And this is in a context where I think initially the U.S. military was the worst offender, but they were quickly joined by Iraqi armed groups and actors who also engage in this kind of indiscriminate violence, which in a way eclipsed the conversation because the American perspective could be like, well, Americans are killing far fewer civilians on the ground these days than their Iraqi counterparts or than these Iraqi groups, and in my view, as an American citizen and analyst, I don't think that false equivalency gets us off the hook for asking what Americans should be doing with their lethal force. So, do you think we've irreparably crossed into a point where in our governing culture there simply isn't a widespread or deeply rooted view that rule of law is more important than law enforcement impunity or military strength?
No, I don't think we've passed some point of no return. I think there's, I think you see that, for example, in the overreach and the killing and then smearing of Alex Peretti over the weekend, that is a bridge too far. Like it's one thing to label entire populations in the Middle East or people on these boats in the Caribbean, the Pacific, that the government is killing as terrorists. But that dog don't hunt when you apply it to a guy like Peretti. Okay, and you see that response from a number of Republican members of Congress, right? So you think we've reached the limits there. And I think you've seen broader sort of pushback, obviously on the Democratic side of the aisle, but some on the GOP side of the aisle, So that gives me, some hope that there's going to be broader pushback to the use of lethal force domestically, to these violations of civil liberties domestically. Obviously, what you say about the law enforcement shootings being a longer term trend in the abuses of people of color by law enforcement is absolutely true. But I do think it's something new to smear people domestically as terrorists and to justify their extralegal killings on that basis. And I think it fits into the broader pattern of these DHS paramilitaries, and that's what they are. Adopting the trappings of GWAT. There's been a couple of great pieces done in the New York Times and elsewhere, sort of analyzing their kit. They're using the terminology of war, of terrorism. These referring to this as, as Operation Metro Surge, talking about rotations in and out of this theater. And so applying the mindset of armed conflict domestically is incredibly dangerous.
Well, Brian, I think we should leave it there, but I'm really happy to have had this chance to talk to you. And I got a lot of hope from the war powers efforts that you described, which seemed to me one of the real cornerstones of an ability to, or sorry, of an effort to restore rule of law and core ideas about justice and accountability and restraint to the use of force by the U.S. government and its armed agents. I'm Thanassis Cambanis. I'm the director of Century International. I've been talking with Brian Finucane, senior advisor at Crisis Group and former State Department lawyer. Brian, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Listeners, you can look in the show notes and you'll find links to a couple of Brian's recent pieces on this issue. I'm sure we'll be coming back to him and some of his colleagues in this effort over the coming years, because I'm hoping that as democratic norms and practices come back to the fore in the United States, there's going to be an interest in rebalancing. I'd also like to take a moment to say today, this is our 100th episode of Order from Ashes. It's been a real pleasure to be doing this podcast for this long, and thanks for listening. If you've stayed with us for this long today, and we'll see you back here again a week from now, next Monday. Thanks for listening.